Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating our 25th Read for Pixels live stream panel session. This is also the second YouTube live stream of the 10th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Now, the Pixel Project created these multi-author panel sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. And what better topic for us to discuss this weekend, which is also International Women's Day weekend, than a voice of her own, the portrayal of women and girls in historical fiction. And here to take part in the discussion are three award-winning best-selling historical fiction authors from different genres. So to my right is Marie Brennan. Marie is the Nebula and World Fantasy Award nominated and Hugo Award-winning author of the memoirs of Lady Trent, other fantasy series, several poems, and over 90 short stories. She is also half of M.A. Carrick, and as M.A. Carrick, she has also written the Rook and Rose trilogy, and you can find her on Patreon. Next, right below Marie is Rhys Bowen. Rhys is the internationally best-selling author of two historical mystery series, the Molly Murphy novels set in early 1900s New York City, and the lighter Royal Spiners books featuring a minor royal in 1930s England. She also writes best-selling standalone historical novels, including The Venice Sketchbook and Mrs. Endicott's Splendid Adventure. Her books have won 20 major awards to date and have been translated into over 30 languages. And next to Rhys and right below me is Sara Tantlinger. Sara Tantlinger is the author of the Bram Stoker Award-winning The Devil's Dreamland, which is poetry inspired by H.H. Holmes, and the Stoker-nominated works To Be Devoured and Cradleland of Parasites. She's an active Horror Writers Association member and participates in the Pittsburgh chapter. And aside from joining today's panel, Marie, Rhys, and Sara have donated some exclusive goodies to the stash of author treats we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels International Women's Day 2026 Rally Up fundraising page. And so we're going by region because not all goodies are open to people everywhere. So for goodies that are open to US donors only, so Marie is offering one signed bound galley of the first book of The Sea Beyond, which is an upcoming historical fantasy duology from M.A. Carrick, set in an alternate Golden Age Spain where conquistadors are conquering mystical fairy islands alongside the New World. This is so exclusive that you'll literally be one of the first people to read it outside of M.A. Carrick and their editors. And this is actually gone. Someone actually made the donation, stepped it up as soon as we put up the fundraising page. And Sara is offering her goodie bundle of Splendid Horror. This bundle, carefully curated by Sara herself, includes one copy of The Cyanide Constellations, which is a fiction collection. This is in paperback, and Sara will sign and personalize it for you. And one copy of her novella, To Be Devoured. This is a limited hardcover edition. Sara will also sign and personalize it to you. And one set of swag comprising 2 author bookmarks and 5 stickers. And now for donors anywhere in the world, Rhys is offering one signed and personalized first edition hardcover of Vanished in the Crowd, her latest Molly Murphy book, that will be launched tomorrow, officially launched tomorrow on International Women's Day. So this is a great read. And also one signed and personalized first edition hardcover from Cradle's Grave, which is her latest Royal Spiners novel. And Marie will write out and sign an original poem on a postcard and mail it to you. This poem comes from a private archive of poetry that she has written over the years, and she will select one that is just right for you. And again, this has gone. The moment we put up the fundraising page, someone just don't make the donation and stepped it up. And Sara is providing something, is donating something that it's the first time we've ever had this. It's a poetry critique bundle for Read for Pixels donors who are poets. And this bundle will include one poetry critique of up to 10 pages of poems, 5 follow-up questions about the poetry critique if there are any questions and clarifications that you need. And Sara is also happy to answer 5 general questions about anything related to writing, publishing, poetry, or anything similar to things like that. Right now, we've raised $945 towards our $5,000 goal so far. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends in April 2026. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And now you, the audience, will be able to ask the panelists, questions live. But just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them for me to read out to Marie, Rhys, and Sara to answer. And we will also put your questions on screen. And now let's begin with today's panel. So women have always participated in shaping history, even when formal power structures excluded them. Yet historical records and fiction have not always reflected this reality. For centuries, women in recorded history were often confined to the margins, appearing primarily as wives, muses, or symbols, rather than historical agents. Scholars and feminist theorists such as Gerda Lerner have argued that the historical record itself has frequently erased or minimized women's contributions. Literature has mirrored this pattern. Early novels often centered the male experience, while female characters were usually sidelined, villainized, or heavily stereotyped in negative ways. Now, feminist historical fiction, at least those written in English, emerged in the late 18th century, coinciding with the first wave of feminism, but gained significant traction and a distinct voice in the 20th century, so the 1970s to the 1980s. While early Gothic fiction by women in the 1790s explored female rationality, modern feminist historical fiction actively reclaims women's roles, focusing on suffrage, autonomy, and challenging patriarchal narratives in history. Historical fiction now often reframes domestic spaces, informal networks, and private lives as politically and historically significant. It has also become a space for discovery and recovery, bringing forward overlooked lives, illuminating informal influence, and helping readers better understand how women actively shaped their worlds, even when the record is fragmentary or absent. And with that in mind, today's discussion, for today's discussion, our distinguished panel of authors, Marie, who writes historical fantasy, Rhys, who writes historical mystery, and Sara, who writes historical horror, will be discussing the evolution and portrayal of women and girls in historical fiction across the genres. So with that in mind, let's get today's panel conversation started. Now, across much of literary history worldwide, women and girls have been portrayed as archetypes and stereotypes which reflected the gender norms of their eras. Indeed, prior to the late 18th century, historical fiction and accounts of historical events usually centered great men while sidelining women. Though authors like Jane Austen, Anne Bronte, and George Eliot wrote novels focused on women's stories, early feminist themes in historical fiction only started becoming more mainstream alongside Gothic fiction when authors like Mary Wollstonecraft began advocating for women's rights in the 1790s, and then later on in the late 20th century, we witnessed a surge in explicitly feminist historical fiction that was driven by second-wave feminism. Now, question 1. Do you think these changes that pushed for the centering of women in historical stories and narratives have continued into the 21st century in terms of how women are portrayed in historical fiction across the genres, be it historical mystery, historical fantasy, or historical horror? So let's hear from historical fantasy first, Marie.
We're definitely still, seeing those novels and seeing them becoming generally more intersectional, because you mentioned like the different evolutions of feminism. What I've seen in fantasy is that we're getting a lot more of the viewpoints that weren't being included before, not just of women, but of specific types of women. So a lot more discussion of queerness in the past, or seeing in English stories from other parts of the world that aren't necessarily as familiar to Anglophone readers. Like there's a whole cluster of novels that have been set in China or inspired by Chinese history in some fashion. Like Iron Widow is not exactly historical fantasy, but Wu Zetian is like the central figure in it, and it's being done as this science fantasy kind of thing. So I see a lot more of that like intersectional feminism starting to show up in the genre, or it's been showing up for a little while, of looking at the ways that it's not just women in an isolated box, but how that's intersecting with other kinds of marginalization.
Rhys, what's happening in historical mystery?
Well, the interesting thing about historical mystery having a female sleuth is that she is per se bucking the trend. She is out there. She is doing something that a man would consider to be a man's job. So I think from the very first female sleuths onwards, we have moved more and more to see what a woman can do. And of course, not historical, but the big changes in the mystery genre came with Sue Grafton, Marcia Malla, and Sarah Paretsky in the late 80s, when they all came up with private eyes who were really, as you might say, kick-ass broads. They carried guns, and they were not in any way hampered as women. And so I think that has inspired all of us, and that we've accepted the challenges, because my Molly Murphy, who is a sleuth in the early 20th century in New York, she has to deal with a lot of things, not only with perceptions of what women should do, but also the physical reality of how do you chase somebody when you're wearing all those skirts? You can't climb away over a wall. You've got little pointy shoes. You're not allowed in a lot of places. You're not allowed in taverns. There are certain places where women just can't go. So she starts off with a huge disadvantage. But when you're looking at reality at the time, and of course I do loads of research, everything I write about is a real time and a real place. There was at that very same time the first very successful female detective in the NYPD at that time. They realized what they had on their hands was that a woman could walk through anywhere unnoticed. You have her with her shopping basket on her arm, and she can follow anybody anywhere, because women were just overlooked. They're part of the furniture. So they realized how very useful female detectives could be.
And that invisibility continues now, right? We talk about women's invisibility, but that means we can go to lots of places and nobody's going to notice us. Oh, Marie, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, because you mentioned the clothing thing, I got challenged. I practiced karate, and at one point I got challenged to do a karate kata in a late Victorian dress. And I was fascinated to find that the biggest problem was the sleeves. I did not have a range of movement in my shoulders that I was used to.
No.
Okay, so Sarah, what happened with historical horror?
I think with horror, we're seeing definitely both the things that Marie and Rhys mentioned. That intersectionality is definitely building, and there's been a lot more diversity in horror, with queer horror, and just celebrating women of color writing horror more. Like, we keep pushing for these things and trying to get more eyes on these books, and I have seen a lot of improvement in that area. We still have a long ways to go in horror, that's for sure, but even just like looking at the Bram Stoker Award ballot that came out recently, and seeing just how much more inclusive it is now compared to past years, where it was just almost, there would be categories exclusively of white men. Like, just having women nominated in the novel category alone is groundbreaking, because it's been so overlooked. So I think we're seeing a lot of good new pushes and new ground being covered, and also a lot of women reclaiming tropes in horror that have been used against them. So maybe we'll go into that a bit later, but that's probably a really big thing I've seen with horror, is just reclaiming certain words and tropes and stereotypes and using it to empower our characters, whether they're historical or modern day.
So I'm curious, do all of you think, because I mentioned that there's the second push in historical fiction in the 1970s and 80s, where it's definitely recentering women in historical narratives, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Do you think that has accelerated since the 1980s in historical fiction in your genre, Marie?
To say if it's accelerated, just because I don't have a good enough sense of like the specifics of what did get published back then and what's being published now. Like, I've certainly read individual books, but I don't have like the stats to back it up. And I'm no longer in grad school, but I still have but if I don't have the numbers, then how can I really say?
Rhys, what do you think in historical mystery? Has it accelerated?
Well, I think the whole genre of historical mystery is a very recent one. I don't think you can find many historical mysteries before probably the mid to late 80s. And then the interesting one, if you want to say what were the first historical mysteries that you can come up with, the ones I come up with immediately are ones featuring medieval prioresses. If you ran a big convent, you were more free than any woman at the time, because some of them answered to nobody except the Pope. Even the King of England couldn't boss them around, because some of the priories were very powerful women, so they could do things outside of the norm that a wife or an unmarried mother couldn't do. They had freedom.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about prioresses.
Mm-hmm.
So they answer to nobody but the Pope.
There were certain things. There were the highest level. Some of the royal convents. They probably, it was someone related to the royal family who became the prioress. In those times, if I'm talking about this because the book I'm writing right now, part of it's set in 1450, so I'm very conversant with all this at the moment. If someone didn't want to marry, they had no option. What did you do? You either married or you went into a convent. If your family didn't want to pay for you anymore if you weren't going to marry, so they would put someone in, or if you were a difficult woman, they would put you into a convent, and if you came from a noble family, they'd give a big dowry. So a lot of the women in these convents came from powerful families and had extreme influence in how the politics worked. So they're good characters to write about.
Oh, that's fascinating. Sara, what do you think? What about in horror? For people who write about historical figures, female historical figures in horror that's centered around historical female figures, do you think that has increased since the 1980s, or at least in the last 10 years or so?
I think so. I mean, at least coming from female writers, women writers, yes, for sure. I'm not sure how it would, kind of like Marie said, I don't know the numbers very well off the top of my head, but I just think about something that's really exploded in horror is women writing Westerns. Like, there's like these whole series of weird Western books. And I think it's so interesting that so many women in horror kind of reclaiming that genre. So even something like that's really exploded recently is definitely, so leagues ahead of, when I think of like 70s, 80s horror, I think of a lot of like schlock and pulpy things, and probably things where women were not being, written about very well, and we're probably falling into a lot of stereotypes. So I think horror is always changing, and it's really fun to see women take these characters like the Westerns. Like, I just never would have thought about that, but they're so fun to read, and it's so interesting to see like women gunslingers that are maybe based on some characters like in gold mining and things like that. It's so interesting to me.
I was going to say that parallels the thing with the prioresses of the Western frontier was a place where women often did have a lot of opportunities that they didn't if they were living back in some East Coast cities. So
Yeah.
And they had to, right? Because they were pioneers alongside their husbands and their fathers and their brothers.
Yeah, and what often happened in the West too was that the father of the family died, and then she's alone there out in the frontier, and she has to learn how to protect herself, how to use a gun, how to show that she's not afraid. And amazing. I mean, if you read those the diaries of the women of the Westward movement, you'd be amazed at what these women. You know, they went across the country on wagon trains. They buried their babies as they went along, and it just the strength they must have had that they didn't give in.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing them come alive in stories more and more, and I'm so glad about it.
Yeah.
So, speaking of those women, let's talk about female characters in feminism and historical fiction. So, in your opinion, what makes historical fiction uniquely suited to interrogate sexism, misogyny, and violence against women? Marie.
I think that it has the opportunity to look directly at the roots of the stuff that we're dealing with now, to say, like, what are the social structures and the kinds of pressures that led to these ideologies in the first place? And so, you know, now it's not that we don't have sexism, but often the dynamics are a little bit more buried than I think they are sometimes in historical periods. You know, if you look at history and you look at things like the sheer amount of time that women had to spend pregnant and nursing because child mortality rates were so high. And like, that's one of the things that's going to influence women's role in society is the amount of time that they have to spend having children, because if they don't, literally society is going to collapse from lack of people. Like, it's, the numbers are appalling. If you've never looked into historical infant mortality, it's like 50% of your children are not going to live to grow up. So for starters, you have to have twice as many just to keep, you know, the population there. And you can look at things like the ideology that you're getting out of maybe religion and such is very explicitly stated. They're not like subtextual about it. They are preaching it in the churches or the temples or wherever. And seeing those much more overt dynamics, we can see, okay, this is what caused that to exist in the first place, in a way that if you're just looking at the modern end, it starts feeling like, well, why is it even like that? And I think understanding where it came from helps us deal with its like modern incarnations a little bit more effectively.
Rhys, what do you think?
Well, in my books, I focus on two real time periods. I'm thinking my Molly Murphy mysteries, New York, early years of the 1900s. As such, it was a time of great change and flux. You had the melting pot of everybody coming in as an immigrant from somewhere, and so women were finding out what could be done, what couldn't be done. You know, and a lot of immigrant families came in. And the one that could find work immediately was the young daughter in a sweatshop. And she was the one who learnt English, who came home and taught it to the rest of the family. And so she was the breadwinner for a lot. And so one of my early Molly Murphy mysteries focused on the treatment of the girls in the sweatshops and the early strikes of the Ladies' Garment Workers Union and how they were brutally put down. And also it foreshadowed, in one of the books, it foreshadowed the Triangle Fire, the conditions these girls worked under, and how they were locked in so they didn't steal any of the trimmings, you know. And that's what happened in the Triangle Fire, was the girls couldn't get out, the door was locked. So that's one time I focus on. The other time I focus on is World War II in my big standalone novels. And the interesting thing about, I think one of the reasons that drove so many of us to write about World War II was that there were so many books that came out after the war, and they said, I flew in this combat squadron and I was in a submarine and I escaped from a big prison. Aren't we brave men? And nobody said, yeah, there were brave women too. You know, they thought, oh, the little women were home at the home front. And more and more stories have come out about incredible bravery among women. In one of my books called The Paris Assignment, focuses on a young woman who's dropped in enemy France as a courier. And she has to take messages from a radio to the resistance and vice versa. And when you look at the figures, the survival rate of these women was 25%. And yet they still volunteered. and they knew they had a really short time there, and they knew what would happen once they were captured, and yet they still did it. So I love focusing on the fact that, yes, there were all these brave women, the ones who broke the codes in Bletchley Park. For years, they had to sign the Secrets Act. They were not allowed to tell anybody. And everybody thought, oh, what a nice little office job she had. And really, she was saving an Atlantic convoy, because she was the one who saw where the submarines were. And so it's really wonderful, in my opinion, to be able to highlight these women now, before the last people who were involved in World War II die, and say, look, this is what was being done. So I think, the whole thing about historical fiction is we are free to highlight these women in a way that makes it palatable to the normal reader, that they can read all these things, but at the same time, they've got an exciting story, they've got interesting characters, they've got everything you want in a good novel, but you're getting the facts as well. You're getting the facts that, oh my goodness, did these girls do this in 1900? Did this woman do this in 1940? And I think we have a wonderful opportunity here.
Sarah, what do you think?
Oh gosh, with horror, there's so much, it's almost overwhelming, because you can just take any moment from history and apply it through a horrific lens of what these women went through. But I also think a lot about how, art holds a mirror up to society, and we pick the parts back that we want to reflect. And with horror, it's often those parts of ourselves we don't want to look at. So I think horror is really well suited to look at these historical figures and give them a voice in some way. In my short story collection, I have a story inspired by the Radium Girls and all of the terrible things that they went through with licking the radium paintbrushes and their teeth falling out and their bones crumbling. And it's just so overwhelming to research. But in my story, since it's horror and I could put a little, fantastical sense in there, I have a character that essentially is resurrected and seeks revenge on the men that put her in that position. So horror is fun. So you can kind of do those things and get away with it and give the women a little revenge. So you can have fun with it, or you could go a more serious route. And I really like that, fiction allows us to have those choices of how we want to tell those stories back and how we want to engage the readers. Sometimes it's nice to have a little revenge, and sometimes it's more rewarding to maybe give different emotions as you're writing. But the possibilities are endless.
When you mentioned the triangle fire, it just put me in mind of the second Enola Holmes film, where it was. Have you seen the Enola Holmes films, Rhys? So basically, they basically unionized. The women unionized because so many of them were being killed for profit. They worked in a matchstick factory, and apparently that's a real thing, that the women actually unionized and went to Parliament to get their rights. As workers. Yeah.
Well, that's what was happening with the Ladies' Garment Workers Union, is they were exploiting the young girls because they had nimble fingers, etc. And they made sure in a factory that they chose them from different ethnic groups. They'd have a Jewish girl and a Polish girl and because they figured they couldn't talk to each other. And therefore, they couldn't unionize. Of course, what they did was they all learned English very quickly. And they did, but any of the early strikes were brutally oppressed. The police, that you'd have the thugs from the factory who would attack these girls, and the police would be standing there with their arms folded just watching because they'd been bribed. So when you think that ordinary women were so brave, I mean, a lot of my books actually feature the suffrage movement in many ways, and the early suffragists. They were thrown into jail. They were in England, especially the suffragettes in England, being force-fed and just humiliated in so many ways, and they kept going. And what struck me too was when there was a suffragist march, people hurling abuse at them as well as hurling mud at them and things. And a lot of the people hurling abuse were other women. They were saying, "Go back to your husbands. Go back to your husbands in the kitchen and stop being so stupid." And yet they kept on going.
Oh, Marie.
You mentioned Enola Holmes. One of the things that I imagine a lot of people think is very fantastical in that movie is like, oh, yeah, like she would know martial arts. The 19th century suffragists studied jujitsu as self-defense against the police coming after them and against men attacking them. So, yeah, that's actually completely historically accurate.
Yeah. And they also changed dress, you know, our concept of what women should wear, because they did, first of all, bloomers, and then sort of divided skirts. Divided skirts were a big thing, and once they tried them on, like, oh, this is really good. My heroine, Molly Murphy, has her best friends who live across the alleyway are a lesbian couple who try everything first, and so she gets to wear a divided skirt and thinks, oh, no, I'm never going back after this.
And just a quick PSA for everyone out there who is watching this. You can learn more about the suffragettes if you can go to the National Portrait Gallery in London, and they have a lot of paintings, portraits of suffragettes, and they include explanations about what those suffragettes did next to the paintings. So if anyone wants to get, a level 101, getting on board, learning more about the suffragettes, this is a really great way to do that. So just a quick PSA about that to everybody.
And can I add to that? I think so many young readers, younger readers, they can read about life in New York that I'm writing about, say in 1905. And so much of it sounds very modern. I think if I dropped you in New York in 1905, you'd be quite comfortable. You'd be able to, there'd be electric, there'd be the trams and the trolley and skyscrapers. And you could go into Macy's, and on the food counter, you'd see cans of chili con carne. You'd think you were quite modern. And then you have to remind yourself, half the population couldn't vote. And half the population, the moment you married, you were the property of your husband. He was legally allowed to beat you with a stick no thicker than his thumb. All the property you brought immediately became his. If you tried to leave, you couldn't take the children with you. So literally half the population was beholden to the other half. And I think, you tend to forget that. And you think, well, I had no voice. And so that's good that we can give our characters a voice and we can give our characters achievement. I love doing that.
And that is the perfect segue into the next question, which is, some critics argue that historical fiction authors risk rewriting or imposing modern values on the historical period that their book is set in when they include empowered female characters or female characters who push back against the patriarchal system and structures of that period. How do you respond to critiques that feminist historical fiction reshapes or challenges the traditionally accepted narratives of women's roles in the past, Marie?
We're absolutely reshaping and challenging them. We're just, doing it with facts at our back. Now, I think it is true that, the modern attitude is always going to tinge it, and that's true of the sexist versions as well as, the less sexist versions of things. Like, we can't escape our own, the water that we swim in. But the sheer number of things that the more you actually read history, the more things you find that don't fit that tidy narrative. Things like the 19th century Victorian women were absolutely studying jujitsu to protect themselves. That's not, us imposing a modern idea. That's real. The See Beyond duology, the M.A. Carrick series that I'm writing, we've got one character who shows up in the first book and one we didn't manage to work in until we got into the second, but both of them were assigned female at birth and are, in one fashion or another, extremely genderqueer. One of them literally, dressed up as a man, went to the New World as a conquistador, went around being a horrible person, basically. This is not an admirable individual. Got into duels, accidentally killed their own brother, her own brother, his own brother. We don't have how you decide to talk about the gender is very much going to reflect modern attitudes, because the person at the time would not have recognized words like trans. That's not a concept that was around at the time. But anyway, killed their own brother. Ended up being discovered as a woman, ended up getting dispensation from the Pope to go on wearing man's clothing, and basically lived as a man for the rest of his life. So we didn't make that up. This is a real person. We just, sent that one to the fairy otherworld instead of to the new world for the purposes of our plot. And, you know, we talk about women being written out of history. Sometimes that is so incredibly literal, I can't even believe it. I was reading a book, which unfortunately wasn't published until after I wrote In Ashes Lie, which is part of the Onyx Court series. I would have absolutely used it if it had been out at the time. But it talks about female spies during the English Civil War in the 17th century. And one of the things it mentions is that for the parliamentary side, in the draft minutes of some parliamentary meeting, the like rough copy that got written out, there's a particular woman who's noted as being paid some amount of money for spying. And then if you look at the finished copy of those same minutes, she's being paid that money for nursing. Like, literally, you can see, here's a spy. We have a record that she was a spy, but they didn't want to publicly admit that, so she's being paid for nursing instead. And just the more I read of history, the more I find things like that and realize that, frankly, there's very little that I think I could make up that would be more outrageous than some of the actual history I found. So, you know what? Yeah, we're challenging the narrative, but we're doing it with facts.
Yeah.
Hey, Rhys?
Well, it's not called history for nothing, right? The men have written it. The men have written history until now. But we know we're learning much more when we dig up graves, and we can now do DNA, etc. We know that there were lots of female samurai in old Japan. We know that there were Viking female warriors who were buried with all the honors and with their swords beside them. We know this now. And of course, there were women who joined up in the American Civil War so they could fight alongside their lover or their husband. It's interesting, too, for me, because in this latest book, Vanished in the Crowd, the story deals with a female scientist who is a brilliant researcher into viruses, which have just been discovered, and has to publish all her papers in the name of her very mediocre husband. And this, you know, if you look back, this is an absolute trend over the years. There have been so many researchers and scientists and innovators who were women who did all of the spade work, and then a man stepped in and took the credit for it. And now they're all being highlighted again. And when you read how many of them there were, and the other thing that fascinates me too is the number of women explorers who got on their camel and went across the Gobi Desert or God knows what. And you know, we're just learning about them now too. So, I mean, there's so much scope for us as writers to highlight these women and not have to make anything up. And I mean, obviously, it's always a challenge for us to get into the head of our female character and make her a person, a creature of her own time. And there are certain things that I'm very mindful of, for example, forms of address and who you can speak to and when you can speak to somebody. And in almost every period, there are rules that, you know, you'd never call somebody by their first name and things like that we take for granted. So there are rules that you have to obey if you're going to make your character a person of her time. But then you realize that the people of that time, female people of that time, could do almost anything if they put their mind to it. It didn't always end up nicely for them, but they tried anyway.
Sara, what do you think?
I was thinking about Alma Katsu in her book, The Hunger, which features the Donner Party, and it has a little bit of a supernatural element in it. And I was just thinking about maybe a panel I watched with Alma on it where she was talking about how people react so, you know, passionately about things like that if they're looking for a very specific kind of historical book. So, you know, I don't want writers out there to ever be afraid to play around with things as they're writing historical fiction. Like, you don't have to know the type of glass or the type of wood all the time if you're writing about something. It's fun to research those things, but don't get so bogged down in it that you lose track of your story too. And I was also thinking about, in horror, something like the witch trials, and how a lot of times male horror writers will write about witchcraft and witches in the witch trials. and they can do some outlandish things with their books, and they just never seem to get questioned as much when the women are writing historical horror. And I was just thinking about this recently because I keep seeing some like white male authors get praised over and over for writing about like the witch trials and witchcraft and having witches as protagonists, and I haven't seen like as much praise for women who are writing it with more passion and writing it with more empathy and probably with more research. So things like that are really good to pay attention to too, like when you're promoting books by other people in a historical genre, like, you know, really pay attention to the writers and what kind of work they did behind it, and maybe, you know, their emotional connection to something like the witch trials. That's just one example of many that we could probably think of where this happens in all of our genres. But I definitely just want people to not be afraid of historical fiction, whether they're reading it or writing it. You're allowed to play around with it and have fun with the research.
I should point out with the research that there are certain things, if you get them wrong, you will hear about it from readers. For example, anything to do with firearms. If you anything wrong with a firearm, you will be deluged with things saying, no, you don't realize that the Colt so-and-so. And the other thing is railways. People, anything to do with trains, people are fanatical about. I know in one of my books, my heroine was going from New York to San Francisco, and there was nothing on the journey that was happening apart from she had to get from A to B. Anyway, the train stops in Reno, and she gets off and has a cup of coffee at the station because it's cold. And I got this letter then saying, you don't realize that that particular train took the Winnemucca Cut, and thus it would not have stopped in Reno. And I felt like writing back saying, A, it's fiction, and B, does it matter? You know, but it mattered to him.
My take on that is, you know, there's certain facts that I'm like, if somebody can come to me and say, well, that's not the way that, you know, voting for what professor gets this chair in the University of Salamanca in 1598 was done, I'm like, cool, have a cookie. Like, you managed to think of a fact I didn't have, well done.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, I think it's Shirley Jackson who wrote like a letter back to an angry fan and said, like, if you don't like my peaches, don't shake my tree. That's, I think about that sometimes.
Yeah, I think that the research, I like to think of it as a springboard rather than a straitjacket. It's that by doing the research, I find all those weird things that I would have never made up because they are so much more bizarre than fiction is usually allowed to be. So,
yeah, well, that's one thing is with historical is you find things that are really good, but you can't use because someone would say, oh, that's ridiculous. It couldn't possibly have happened. I mean, that was when I saw this picture of the food counter at Macy's, and the center of it was this big pile of cans of chili con carne. If I said Molly went home and opened a can, I'd get all these letters saying, don't be ridiculous. This is 19, you know, but it's true, but I can't use it. And some of the language is so modern, but I can't use that either.
Oh, you know, it just occurred to me that you all might have gotten more pushback than male authors. If male authors said, you know, Molly stopped at, you know, in Reno and had a cup of, nobody's going to write to that male author and say, no, it's wrong.
I think if he was a train aficionado, he probably would. They care about that.
I will say, I actually haven't gotten a lot of pushback. Like, I don't want people to think that, oh, if I try to write something historical, I am doomed to having these kinds of, you know, emails sent to me. I did get somebody, like, emailing, being like, hey, you mentioned in passing, like, this guy who was the lieutenant of the Tower of London in thus and such year, like, you know, that guy was my ancestor. I'm like, cool. But I haven't gotten a lot of people saying, oh, you're wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think you have more leeway with fantasy because you can say, well, it's actually a parallel universe, so it really doesn't matter, you know?
You would think that, but that's not necessarily the case.
So, moving on. So, female characters in historical fiction, as we have established by now, often live within and engage with patriarchal systems that can marginalize them, be it in private or public spaces. So, do you think reading about female characters in historical fiction who take on and subvert and challenge patriarchal norms and structures could serve as a catalyst for real-world activism to end sexism, misogyny, and violence against women? Marie?
I think so. Partly just because, like, at a baseline level, fiction and reading fiction is an exercise in empathy. And so if you are reading about a woman dealing with these problems, you are imaginatively, like, spending time with her and caring. Theoretically, you're caring about it, or why are you reading this book? And I think that we shouldn't discount how much just kind of the drip, drip, drip of reading about that wears away at people's, like, entrenched patterns of thought. But also, I think it can do something more specific in that when we show how people subverted these, and this is where, again, that, like, embedding it in the history. I will get annoyed when I read a book that is in some historical setting and the character basically just goes, "Oh, la, I shall not allow that to hold me back," and she goes, blitzing off. And I'm like, it wasn't that simple. It usually did not go that well if you just tried to ignore everything. But watching how women actually navigated those problems, and, like, how did they get allies, and how did they use the resources available to them to undermine the restrictions around them, that teaches us strategies, right? It shows us, like, okay, well, maybe if I run head first at it, that's not going to work out. But how can I, like, go around the side and flank the problem? And now I've got what I want.
Rhys, what do you think?
Well, I think the great thing about reading historical fiction is that it's sugarcoating, in a way, the real problems. It's not like, we're not didactic. We're not saying to you now, look what happened to these poor women in that time. You're reading an exciting story and you think, oh, that's terrible. I mean, for example, in the time I write about in Molly Murphy in the early 1900s, in New York, it took the signature of a husband and one doctor to have a woman committed for life to an insane asylum. Now imagine how many annoying or not wanted wives were just put aside that way. And in the book, Molly has to go undercover to rescue a young woman from an insane asylum. And another woman grabs her and says, "Please help me, get me out of here. I'm not insane." And you think, how many of those were? And that's again something. And what you want to do is you want people to think. I mean, you want them to think this is a really good story and follow it. And God, I hope this happens. But you also want people to think, that was terrible in those days, what these women had to endure. And then what I want them to think too is, I can see a lot of parallels about what's happening now. And I think that's where we have the power, is the fact that you can say, oh, there are still young girls who are being trafficked now. Oh, there are places where women can be executed for daring to go against their husband or not refusing to marry. And so, I think we are sparking thought in a way that you'll think you're reading a nice little book and it's very exciting, but we're actually making you think too. And I think that's our power.
Yeah, and I'm just going to chime in about this. The Pixel Project actually at some point at one point a few years ago, we received an email from a young girl who said, "Please, my family is going to lock me away. Please help me." We tried, we couldn't, because that was in India. And we couldn't because she just disappeared after that. So we couldn't track her down, because if we could track her down, we could get people to help, right? Because we know people are on the ground, and Indian feminists are some of the fiercest fighters you will ever see.
Yeah.
But I think they got her before we could do anything. But when we received that email, we've seen so much of all the different types of violence against women we've been around for 17 years now.
Yeah.
And that was the first one we've received that indicated that women and girls are still being locked away in lunatic asylums and insane, in mental asylums for rebelling.
Yeah. When I was writing several years ago, I wrote a series with a Welsh police constable, and I had one of the cases in which a Pakistani girl, they had the corner grocery shop in the village, and the girl came to Evan and said, "My family is planning to take me back. I've just learned my family is going to take me back to Pakistan, and they're going to marry me off to some old man I haven't even seen." And my editor said, "You can't do this. You can't say this in a book." And I said, it really happens. And I actually got newspaper cuttings and sent them to her and said, this is what happens to girls. They say, we're going back to Pakistan for a nice family celebration. And you think, oh, good. And when you get there, the celebration is your wedding. And what's more, they take away your passport. And there actually is a branch of the British Foreign Service whose only task is to go to places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and rescue girls who've been trapped there.
Yeah, if you get any editor who tries to push back against this in the future, I can tell you it's still going on.
Yeah.
And we had an email from a headmistress in France once, and she said, I don't know what to do. That I have two 16-year-old girls from, I think it was Sudan or Somalia. And she says, they have come to me crying and saying that their parents are going to ship them back to the home country and marry them off to men 3 times their age.
Yes. Yeah.
And we had to, and the headmistress did not know that in France, in the Department of Women and Family, I think, they have a dedicated sub-department that deals with everything from forced marriages, child marriages, and female genital mutilation, because France has a huge influx of African immigrants from all different parts of Africa. And so they realized that this was an issue. And so, like the British Foreign Office, they had this, and even the headmistress did not know about that. So we had to tell her. Yeah. And so she said, thank you, I'm going to go and take action now. I'm going to get help. Yeah. But it still happens. Yeah. Anyway, so we don't want to derail the conversation. Sarah, what do you think?
Sometimes in horror, it's frustrating because it's almost like you have to trick some people into reading these kind of stories, because the people who care, you already know they care, you know they're reading it, you know what they're going to get out of it. So it's still a struggle, I think, to find ways to cross those lines and connect with the people who need to hear these stories and realize that these horrible things are based in reality, and that's why we're still telling these stories in horror. But on a more positive note, within the horror community, I see like charity anthologies and projects going on constantly. Like the horror community is always doing something and donating it to amazing causes constantly. And usually that's from small presses. And I always say small presses are the lifeblood of horror. They're the ones that support us when the big presses don't view us as trendy anymore and things like that. So it's I think having these conversations and just bringing these topics up is so important. And also in horror, we deal with a lot of, not always male writers, it comes from all writers in horror too, that just use sexual assault as that's the gimmick, that's the whole catalyst, that's the entire woman's character. So if we keep having these conversations and hopefully spread more awareness of, does that really need to happen to that character? What is your intent behind portraying this story? Think about the people who are going to be reading this, and just continuing those conversations is, the best way we can hope for change, I think.
Mm-hmm. So speaking about that, so let's talk about writing historical fiction. So one of the ways in which historical fiction authors from any genre can help with changing the patriarchal culture that normalizes violence against women now and in the years to come is to write stories that handle the issue appropriately. And that means including more female characters that are complex and compelling. So what advice would you give to up and coming historical fiction writers who want to center women in their stories, not just as survivors or symbols, but as agents of narrative and justice? Marie.
Well, part of it is just the making them the viewpoint characters, because if you have this female character in the story, but your protagonist is a guy, then anything that happens to her is being processed through the lens of how does it affect him, right? And that right there is already creating problems for you. And the other thing, as we've kind of been alluding to here, is do your research, not because somebody's going to email you and say, that train would have went through the Winnemucca Gap, but because you're going to find so many things that you didn't think were possible and things that you just like weren't even a part of your mental image of that time period. And having that fodder in your brain is going to help you write an interesting, complex story that does exactly that thing of saying, like, here's this amazing adventure. And by the way, I'm also, talking about this issue, but not in that preachy kind of way. So yeah, go read more history, read better history than the really bland textbooks they handed you in school. History is insane. It is full of bonkers things that you would never make up, and it's delightful. And then you can make delightful stories out of it.
Rhys?
Well, the first thing I would say to anybody who wanted advice on writing any novel with a female protagonist is that make her active and not passive. Things should not be happening to her. She should be controlling her environment, and maybe sometimes she makes bad decisions, but decisions have to be hers. So that is one thing. The other thing is, I'm now writing this series with my daughter, and she is a passionate researcher. She will read the New York Times for every day that we're writing about. I have to say, sometimes she's a little too intense. She will say, oh, well, you have to make sure Molly has to take an umbrella because it's going to rain that afternoon. And I go, it's fiction. But when you read that, you pick up all the little tiny stories that people would not know about now, and you think, oh, well, that's really interesting that happened to that woman then. And I mean, one thing that comes out is my heroine, Molly Murphy, is now married, and people write to me and say, oh, her husband Daniel is so horrid, etc. And I write back and say, no, you don't understand. For the time, he's really enlightened. He lets her go out and do things that are actually quite dangerous. And sometimes he will be angry that she's done it because he fears for her. But he could really say, I forbid you to do that. But he doesn't. So, it's... I think what I started to say was reading something like the New York Times really grounds something in the time you're writing about, and you get the absolute feel for, you get the small things that happened every day that will bring you into that time, so that you're writing about a real time and people can read it and go, oh, well, that's really interesting. That's how it was then. And that's what you want them to say. That's how it was.
Sara, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely everything that Marie and Rhys said. Maybe something I would add is, like, someone who loves female villains, it's really interesting to read about the histories and past of these women, and you can play around with that too. For example, I just finished a poetry collection called Panico by Azura Knox, and it was all about Marie Antoinette during her most harrowing moments. And she did such a good job of showing the kind of shallowness and how Marie Antoinette was perceived versus the moments where her children are being ripped from her, how her execution was handled so much more brutally than her husband's execution. So just little things like that are so interesting to reflect on too. So you can still have complex, interesting villains as well who are females, and add to their stories and give readers something to take away from that too.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up the villains, because it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, it must all be, wonderful heroines and role models that we can, aspire to follow. But number one, that's just a different version of, we have to put women on a pedestal, right? Which is part of the problem. You can also have women who are bad. And I think, Rhys, you were the one who mentioned, or maybe it was Sara, that the suffragettes, many of the women who were screaming at them and telling them to go home were other women. Yeah. That patriarchy isn't just upheld by men, women do it too. And that's a thing that we need to acknowledge if we're trying to show the whole picture of what's going on here.
Especially now in America, we need to write very hard about that.
So, that got me in mind of an author called Virginia Feitas, and she wrote 2 books, I think, or 3, where it's historical horror. And basically, I think one of the books was about a nanny in the Victorian era, the Brontes era, and she makes the nanny a complete psychopath, complete sociopath, and she basically pushes the whole negative stereotype thing to its most ridiculous extreme. And then people read it and go,
Yeah.
but, I think at the same time, she was showing that, women are complex. Women and historical figures are women in these professions that were historically female dominated, right? They weren't perfect either. So we don't put them on a pedestal. We show how women are human. Women are, women can do bad things as well. I mean, you need to acknowledge that in history.
Yeah.
Because like I say, not everyone is a saint, right? Not everyone is fighting for women's rights. There's a lot of internalized misogyny going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Rhys, do you want to say anything?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. So, so we come to our second to last question. So, people in the audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, now's your last chance to write them in the YouTube chat box, and we'll put them out on screen for the authors to answer before we wrap up today. But let's go on to our second to last question, which is, how can historical fictions engage with the issue of violence against women in their stories and explore justice for victims without sounding preachy? So, Marie.
Yeah, there's a definite problem in especially certain corners of fantasy. I'm going to point directly at George R. R. Martin. Game of Thrones is the title for the TV series. A Song of Ice and Fire is the books. He definitely is one who has fallen victim to that, like, oh, in the past it was just, rapey all over the place, like women being sexually assaulted everywhere. And man, the number of historians I have seen get up in arms about it, that they're like, you are exaggerating how bad it was to kind of like make, modern times look better effectively. And it's not that that didn't happen. Obviously it did, but treating it as back then it was just all the time to everybody constantly, like, no, that's not the reality. And I have managed to lose track of where the question began, because that came to mind and I got very upset about it. Could you repeat, please?
Oh, so the question is, how can historical fiction authors engage with the issue of violence against women in their stories and explore justice for victims without sounding preachy?
Yeah. And I guess that the problem I see more often in fantasy right now is treating it as just like ambient radiation rather than exploring that question of justice and what were the social structures that would like limit this, and what were the responses that got made. And obviously, if we look at a lot of societies and the historical answers to those questions, it's not going to look that great, because it's things like, oh, well, yes, there absolutely was backlash if a woman got sexually assaulted, because the men around her go, you have now, besmirched my honor by doing this, and so I'm gonna, go kill you or something. But I think especially when it's being done where the female characters are viewpoint, they're not just, being processed through somebody else's lens. That's probably the most important thing, is what does she do? How does she find healing after being assaulted or being assaulted sexually or otherwise? And what are the kinds of recourse open to her? It's a lot more complex than you might think. Like, there were lawsuits. It wasn't always just honor killings or somebody goes and murders the guy. Like, lawsuits also happen. That was a real option. So I'd like to see more of that rather than just the, oh yeah, the past was a rape fest kind of approach that you get in a certain corner of fantasy right now.
Rhys?
Well, the nice thing about writing mystery, crime novels, is that the whole arc of the story is a quest for justice. And so anything that happens to a woman in the book, we hope that by the end of the book, it might not end happily, but it ends with justice. And the nice thing about that is it's not always true in real life, but in a fiction, you can make it happen. And I think that's very satisfying.
Sarah?
It's kind of fun in horror right now. There's a trend of like good for her female rage books that are going around, and I enjoy seeing how people are tackling that, because it is hard sometimes to not fall into that preachy point. You can just kind of get carried away with yourself. And if you can step back and really look at it through a lens of like, okay, am I getting my point across? Can I edit this down? Can I take some things out and still get the point across? That's a really helpful tactic as a writer, just to try to get some more objective lenses on it. But I also want women to feel free to, you know, express these things how they want to, especially in horror, because we're very tired. I just had a group chat with a bunch of women in horror not long ago where we were talking about just kind of all the microaggressions that we're still dealing with from men in the genre. So I definitely support women highlighting these things any way they can in their fiction.
Yeah,
sorry, can I add one thing to this? Is recently I've had to deal in my books a lot with editors who are terrified about being PC. You know, there was one book in which it takes place in the 1930s. It was one of my Royal Spinous books, and there's a man who's way too grabby with the servants, and when his niece was young, he would sort of sit her on his knee, and it was all very creepy. And my editor sort of said, "Oh, either can we back off from this, or can we have an author's note at the end to say, you may be disgusted by this, but this is how it was at the time." And the fact that you have to do that these days, to me, is really annoying, because, you know, it should be obvious that when you read it, you say, oh, this is how it was at the time, and it probably still is going on now.
Yeah. So, you know, we actually thought about all of that when we were the Pixel Project a few years back. We had a charity anthology, which is a horror anthology called Giving the Devil His Due. And so it's all about revenge stories against, you know, violent men who get their comeuppance. And some of the stories that were included are historical fiction. We did consider putting out a content warning, because we know a lot of survivors and all read our books, and we do issue content warnings if we talk to people about it and all that. But here's the interesting thing: we saw feedback on Amazon to the book, and Sarah would be particularly interested in this. We actually had one person write, "Thank you for putting together this anthology. I read it, and it stopped me from going after my sister's abuser, and I would be sitting in prison now if I hadn't read all these stories." Yeah. So I think there's a fine line to walk here, because we don't want to trigger people who are survivors, but we also want people to understand that these things happen. And I think in historical fiction, they happen a lot. It's not all rapey and all, but it happens a lot. Like Rhys says, it happens, and people need to face the reality that it happens. And for a long time, people didn't really do anything about it. So anyway, we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to put that on screen. So Arnzem M says, are there historians, nonfiction, that you are fans of or who have influenced your approach to fiction, particularly female writers? Marie?
Yeah, the Onyx Court series that I wrote some years ago, which each book of it is set in a different century of London's history. It goes from the Elizabethan period up through the Victorian. There is a historian, or she actually passed away recently, which makes me so sad, Liza Picard. She has a series of books that are Elizabeth's London, Restoration London, Dr. Johnson's London, Victorian London, and they're daily life books about what was it like to just like live in London in these time periods, which happen to map perfectly to the centuries I needed for my series. And she's really good about paying attention to not just, you know, what was life like, but what was life like for women. And, you know, often in very like dryly entertaining ways. She talks about how, I think it was the 18th century book. She said, you know, the busk of a corset was supposed to descend to the lady's honor. And that, you know, imagine like sitting down in a wherry to cross the Thames or something like that with the busk of your corset jabbing you in your honor. So like they're very entertaining books, and they're very granular about that lived in life rather than like big historical events. And so it grounds you so much in what it was like to be a person living in that time period, and with good attention rather than just like that one, you know, here, we'll do one chapter about women and the rest of it assumes men. Like it doesn't have that feel to it. She's very like holistic about it.
Rhys?
Well, I've been trying to think, and I think most of my reading has been reading books that were written in the time by, you know, obviously by women if I wanted to, but I can't think of a single female historian who has made a huge impression. But I thank you, Marie, for the tip. I'm going to read those.
Sarah?
It's more contemporary, but there's a really great book. I looked up the title, make sure I got it right. Monster, She Wrote: The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction by Lisa Kroger and Melanie Anderson. And it's such a great book. I highly recommend it for anyone who just kind of wants to get more of the history of women in horror in their brains. And then I've also been reading a book about killer, like poison fashion for something that I'm writing. And that's by Allison Matthews David, who researched a lot of, poisonous clothing. So that's my current inspiration for a book I'm writing.
Okay.
Like the arsenic green and things like that.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
The mercury hats are what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah.
Mercury hats.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
That's why we have the phrase "mad as a hatter," because they used mercury in the processing of the materials for hats, and so they would go insane from the mercury.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Actually, I have a book of it's called Lee's Famous Recipes, and it was written in 1900. It's not recipes for food. It's recipes for various medicinal things and cosmetic things. And when you could poison people so easily if you got any of these slightly wrong, you give a cough syrup.
Or even if you get them right.
Yeah.
A got a horror, just look at medicine and cosmetics.
It's got chloroform and opium and God knows what in it. I mean,
Oh, good Lord. Oh, so the audience member who asked the question says, fantastic, thank you. Poisonous clothing. And he also says, P.S. This chat is fantastic. I'm learning a lot.
Oh,
and our producer actually put some links up to the books they're talking about. So there's Goodreads author Liza Picard. You can go there and find out what books she's written. There's also for Monster, She Wrote, and you can go up there to see to learn more about the book. I'm putting this on screen because this is being recorded, so later on you can actually go back, fast forward to this point, freeze it, and then figure out and then see the link to it. And there's also the link to the Amazon.com link to Fashion Victims Dangerous Dress, the book that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take this off the screen. And so we have come to our final question of the evening. So what historical fiction novels and series in your genre would you recommend that aspiring writers read to see examples of female characters and feminist ideas being handled well in historical fiction? So Marie.
I'm glad that we had this question in advance, because anytime I get asked, recommend some books, I forget everything I have ever read. But I would say one author I would particularly recommend who's written a number of different historical things, like fairly recently, is Kate Hartfield. She has like one book, The Valkyrie, which is it's kind of set around the time of the Hun invasion of Europe, and it combines a couple of different like Germanic sagas and the like. She has another, The Chatelaine, which was originally published as Armed in Her Fashion. So yeah, she's very interested in history. Full disclosure, she and I have done events together because we both had like Viking novels coming out around the same time. But yeah, Kate Hartfield's work is one I would recommend.
Rhys?
Somewhat historical mystery is quite a new genre, I would say. I mean, I can think of, say, in the 1980s, there was Sharon K. Penman who wrote about a prioress, and also Margaret Fraser did that, and Sharon Newman wrote about a medieval woman, and they were all academics, so you're going to get a really good, accurate portrayal of how things were at that time. If you wanted to know how a convent operated and all that sort of thing, that it's brilliant reading to read that. And if you go more recent history, the first to have like a tough female sleuth or a brave female sleuth, I think, was probably Laurie King, who wrote The Beekeeper's Apprentice, and she's Mary Russell, who is a partner to Sherlock Holmes. And And then I have to say, after that, if you go back to 2001, my first Molly Murphy book, Murphy's Law, was pretty much one of the first female detectives in more modern times.
I can just toss in there Margaret Fraser's work, talking about like what are the ways that we can show how people in history would respond to things. I love that in the first book of her series, there's a bit where these armed men want to break into this church to grab the person that they're coming after, and they break in and they're confronted with a line of nuns singing the Dies Irae at them, and the guys are just like, oh God, I feel bad about myself now. I love that moment.
Sarah.
A book I wanted to recommend and an author is Fairest Flesh by Christy Park Kolsky. And it's a really interesting combination of Snow White, the dark fairy tale, not the Disney one, and Elizabeth Bathory, and the way she combines those ideas and the characters, and you get women characters who are all over the place. They're very complex and have a lot going on. It's a really interesting book, and Christy's some degree in history. I can't remember what it is, but she's brilliant. She knows any historical question I ever have. She has the answer, but it's a really interesting book.
So we've come to the end of the part of this live stream where we're doing the discussion. So before we all go, let's have a quick, for anyone who joined us late, let's have a quick recap of what goodies that are available, because aside from joining today's panel and donating their time to this and expertise, Marie, Rhys, and Sara have donated some super exclusive goodies to the stash of author treats we have up as perks for donors at our fundraising page, which is the Read for Pixels International Women's Day 2026 Ready Up fundraising page, and we will let you know where to go to get those. So for now, just to let you know, Marie's goodies have all gone. Like the moment we put it up, we went live, they just disappeared. Whoosh, they went off out the door. But there are still awesome goodies from Sara and Rhys. So for US donors only, Sara is offering her goodie bundle of splendid horror. And this bundle, which is which is carefully curated by Sara herself, includes a copy of Cyanide Constellations, which is a fiction collection in paperback. And Sara will sign and personalize it for you. And also one copy of To Be Devoured, which is Sara's novella in a limited hardcover edition, also signed and personalized. And one set of swag comprising 2 author bookmarks and 5 stickers. Now, for donors anywhere in the world, even if you're outside the US, Rhys is very generously offering 2 books. So one is the book that we've been talking about, mentioning throughout this discussion, which is a signed and personalized first edition hardcover of Vanished in the Crowd, her latest Molly Murphy book. And there's also one signed and personalized first edition hardcover of From Cradle to Grave, her latest Royal Spiners book. And Sara is generously offering the first ever poetry critique bundle that we had ever offered on Read for Pixels. And this bundle will include one poetry critique of up to 10 pages of poems. 10 pages of poems can be one huge long poem, or it could be a whole collection of small poems. And then that will be followed by 5 follow-up questions about the poetry critique if you need any clarifications about the critique from Sara. And also Sara is happy to answer 5 general questions about anything related to writing, publishing, poetry, or whatever it is that's related to those categories. And there are also plenty more goodies available from authors and publishers, including Karen Auden, who's another historical mystery author. Kelsia Yu, she writes historical horror. She has a book bundle left, I believe. Her other goodies are gone, but she does have a book bundle left, and all 3 of her historical horror novels are included in that bundle. Christy Park Kolsky, that Sara mentioned, she has 2 of her books in a bundle, together with a handwritten postcard with some poetic lines that she's going to handpick for the donor. Laurie R. King, whom Rhys mentioned just now, she's got some books from the series that Rhys has mentioned that she's offering them. She's also offering a couple of Zoom calls. So if you're a historical fiction fan, or if you're curious about historical fiction, this is the time. Laurie will talk to you about that. She'll be very happy to talk to you about that. And also Subterranean Press is offering, they've offered 3 books that are no longer, that are out of print. This is your only time, probably your only opportunity to get those books now, because they aren't around anymore. The Subterranean Press actually held back a couple of copies of these books for charity events like this. And we've raised $945 towards our $5,000 goal so far. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends in April 2026. All funds go towards our work to end violence against women. And just to let everyone know, if you don't know already, the Pixel Project is powered by volunteers. None of us are paid. 100% of our team members are volunteers. So you can be assured that all the funds raised actually go towards our expenses to keep campaigns like Read for Pixels alive. So I'm going to share a slide showing everybody where to go get this. So you can donate for goodies via our Rally Up fundraising page. You go to tinyurl.com/R4P Rally Up IWD 2026. And this is case sensitive, so please be careful when you type in the URL. And you can find out more about Read for Pixels by going to bit.ly/Read for Pixels. And also, the Pixel Project had started partnering with Black Spot Books from 7th November onward, from 2023 onwards. And we partnered to put together this poetry collection. It's a horror poetry collection called Under Her Eye. And if you are interested in feminist and horror poetry, you might want to get your hands on a copy of that. You can buy either the paperback or ebook edition from all major booksellers worldwide. The collection includes poems by 112 acclaimed female and non-binary poets, opening with Know to Be True by Bram Stoker Awards winner Stephanie M. Vitovich, and the writing assignment by HWA Lifetime Achievement Award winner and SFPA Grandmaster Marge Simon, and closes on a powerful note with a map of the backyard by Bram Stoker Awards nominee Jessica McHughes. And as I mentioned, net proceeds from Under Her Eye go towards keeping the Pixel Project's anti-violence against women work alive and kicking. And finally, this is a PSA for everybody. If you want to learn more about violence against women and how to help victims worldwide, please visit thepixelproject.net. We have a whole list of primers about every conceivable type of violence against women you can think about. And sadly, there are many. And for people who want to help victims and survivors, or if you're a victim yourself and you need help, for domestic violence and sexual assault helplines and resources in every UN recognized country and territory in the world, I believe that's 203 countries, please visit the nomoredirectory.org. And if you type in, they have a search box there. If you type in your country name, they will pull up a full list of helplines, hotlines, and organizations who will be able to help you. Now, before we begin, before we wrap up here, we mentioned that, Rhys, you have a book launch tomorrow.
Yes.
For the new Molly Murphy book. Yeah. Congratulations, and I hope that everything goes well. So, Marie, did you have anything you wanted to announce that's coming up for you as well?
Just that the I've been waving around the advanced reader copy of Eye of Leviathan, so I don't have nice cover art, but this is coming out in July. It is the first book of a duology. Second one we're working on right now, and yeah, looking forward to that coming out.
Okay. Oh, before we move on to Sarah, Rhys, where will you be doing the launch?
It's called the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's at 2:00 tomorrow. So if you're anywhere in Arizona and you're watching this, do come along. Love to see you.
Okay. And Sarah, what do you have coming up? Do you have anything coming up?
My fiction collection was just nominated for a Stoker Award, so that's cool. So I'll be at StokerCon in Pittsburgh in June, and tomorrow I'll actually be on a panel with Lindy Ryan, who owns Black Spot Books. So we were just looking at, and Gwendolyn Keist. So I'm not sure when that panel will be out, but in March we also celebrate Women in Horror Month. So if anyone's interested in knowing more about that, feel free to find me online. I'm pretty easy to find. My name is unique enough.
Yeah, and speaking of Women in Horror Month, we will be having a Women in Horror Month panel on the 20th of March. And we will be talking about Sisters That Slay, female friendship and sisterhood in horror. And the panelist includes Linda D. Anderson. So it's going to be a really, really brilliant panel. And finally, to find out more about violence against women, you can go visit us at www.thepixelproject.net. And we've come to the end of today's session. So thank you all, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. And happy International Day, Women's Day, everybody. This is this weekend. If you're in the Far East and Australia, you're already on International Women's Day. If you're in the West, that will be tomorrow. So please do go support all the women's organizations and activists, women's human rights activists that are in your country. Have a good night, everybody.